Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and welcome Smithfield. So good to have you here. My speech today is going to start out with the history of the printed word as it relates to news and to newspapers. The history of the popular press owes a debt of gratitude to the invention of the movable printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century. Gutenberg's press was first used to print Bibles and books, and in the 17th century, actually 1735, the first daily newspaper came out in England, and it was called the Daily Courant. In America, the history of journalism is inextricably entwined with the history of the country itself. The first newspaper published in the American colonies was published in 1690, but was shut down because the publisher, Benjamin Harris, did not have the proper license from the British. Harris's newspaper employed an early form of reader participation, a little bit like our letters to the editor are today. It was a 3-page paper, but with a 4th page that was blank, so that readers could write in their own news. It would be passed along to someone else who would add to it, and then it would go on to another person, and so on. In 1735, Peter Zenger, publisher of the New York Weekly Journal, was arrested and put on trial by the British for allegedly printing libelous attacks on the British government. Zenger was found not guilty on the grounds that his articles were not libelous because they were based on fact. This was a landmark case that established the foundation of a free press in the new nation. By the 1800s, newspapers were flourishing, and by 1833, they had grown into an industry with the introduction of the penny press, a cheap newspaper aimed at the working class audience. Soon after, many other newspapers came into being, with huge increases in circulation and larger printing presses. Newspapers became a mass medium. This period also saw the establishment of newspapers that incorporated the kinds of journalistic standards that we know today, most notably the New York Times, which was established in the mid-1850s. The Civil War brought about advances in photography that allowed newspapers to print photographs as well as the printed word. And the telegraph enabled Civil War correspondents to transmit stories back to their newspapers with unprecedented speed. But the telephone lines often went down, and this led to the development of the inverted pyramid style of writing we see today in our newspapers. That being the heaviest, most important part of the story was transmitted first, and the less important information came last. And as I said, that's the style of journalism that's being used today. In the 20th and in the 21st century, with the introduction of radio, television, and the internet, newspaper readership has been in a sharp decline, although there are signs of a resurgence of interest in the printed word. Tonight I brought along a few different kinds of newspapers for us to talk about. The first one being the very hallowed paper, Minneapolis paper called the Star Tribune. Now what I like to do is, I like to take on weekends, especially when I've got lots of time, I like to take 2 newspapers and put them together, say the Star Tribune and the St. Paul Pioneer Press. And take a look at what the headline story is. In this paper, it happens to be Vote Leaves Stadium in Peril. So we are looking at the possibility of not seeing any stadium legislation this year. This story is really interesting because this calls, the headline calls this fatal Dinkytown hit and run draws a 40-year prison term. The headline in the St. Paul paper was much kinder. There was a difference there. There was no story about the GOP blocking debate on tax hike for the super rich in the St. Paul paper. The story that really caught my eye in this one, though, was the fact that 2 Minnesotans this year won the Pulitzer Prize. And one of them was the composer's Kevin Putz for Silent Night, a Minnesota Opera Company production that had its premiere last November at the Ordway Center in St. Paul. And Tracy Smith won the Poetry Award for Life on Mars, published by Minnesota-based Grey Wolf Press. So we had 2 Minnesotans. Now, this is an interesting mixture of headlines. Now we have a nice human interest story here with the truckers who lined up their rigs to help save the life of a man who was intent on committing suicide. So you've got a little bit of everything, little sensationalism up here in the corner with Mrs. Sensor having allegedly admitted to drinking before she was involved in a fatal accident. So we got a little bit of that. And then there are tiny little squibs here about what's inside the paper. Now, I love to read the headlines. I love to read the letters to the editor. I love to read the editorial section. But what I like most about the Tribune and the New York Times, which I like to get on the weekends, is not in the main section of the paper. It's in the variety section, and it has to do with a couple of puzzles. One is the New York Times crossword puzzle, which is my passion and maybe my habit, if you will. The other is the cryptobook. I love that. I love to get the New York Times on the weekend because that gives a more global look at what's going on in the world, not just so Minnesota concentrated. I also have a real love for the Plymouth Sun Sailor, which is our local paper here in Plymouth. If you're not from Plymouth, I'm sure that your community would have a Sun paper with all of the local events in it. Actually, this really saved me some money. The issue before this one had a 50% off coupon for the Guthrie Theater. And I've never been to the new Guthrie Theater, so I got to go to the Guthrie Theater to see an old Coward play that was absolutely delightful. Thank you, Plymouth Sun Sailor. I even read this one, the Wayzata Public Schools Communicator, because I like to know where my tax dollars are going and what these kids are learning in school, and it's really quite impressive. So this is a good little paper. I don't just throw these into the garbage anymore, but I used to do that, I have to admit. Then there is Access Press, and that's Minnesota's disability community news source. These papers that I'm showing you now can be gotten at the library. Minnesota Good Age, which is for senior citizens. And then we have Vitamin. I love the name of this. And this is also a local paper, but it tells you a lot about film festivals, about the best new foods at Target Center, all that information you really need to know. City Pages, kind of the grandpa of all the little local newspapers, and last but not least, the Onion. So I would say if you have the opportunity to sit down and compare papers, take in all of the opinions, filter them through your own value system, you'll come out with good information and a good idea of what policy is and how it's made. Thank you.